Hi guys, my name is Maria and I am an artist working mainly with pastels and pastel pencils. I mostly focus on realistic animal drawings and today I will be creating a small study of a lion's eye. And I will talk you through every single step of the process so that you can easily follow along and create as you go. So here I am working on white Pastelmat paper and I taped off an 8 by 8 centimeter square using artist's tape, and this will give us nice clean edges once we remove the tape at the end. Then to transfer the reference, I chose to use the grid method and I drew a 4 by 4 grid. You can absolutely sketch it freehand, but this method just lets us get to the fun part way quicker, which is the colors, the layering, and adding all the texture. Now that the sketch is finished, it's time to start building the first layers. For these, I am using PanPastels, which is one of my favorite mediums for blocking in the base colors. I am starting with burnt umber, and this is a lovely warm neutral that works really well as a foundation for the different colors we will build up later. One of the main goals at this stage is simply to cover the white of the paper, because leaving too much white showing through can make it difficult to judge your values and the colors accurately. So basically establishing an overall base tone makes it much easier to compare the lights and the darks as the drawing is evolving. To finish blocking everything in, I am using raw umber tint for the lighter areas and then Payne's gray for the darker, cooler areas. And this is exactly why I love starting with the pan pastels, because they blend so easily and cover the surface really nicely. So this gives you a smooth and even base to work on. Now I begin outlining the eye itself, and for that I'm using a black pencil. And since the eye is really the focal point of this whole drawing, I am paying very close attention to the reference here and making sure that the shapes are as accurate as possible, since that is actually the hardest thing to correct later on. So around the eye, there's this very dark rim that really helps define this shape, and that's what I'm drawing. And then I'm using some dark warm gray to map out some of the softer shadows around the eye as well. And I'm also adding a couple of the dark shadows in the fur that I can see from the reference photo. Now we're getting to the fun part of the drawing where we're actually focusing more on color, especially here in color temperature. Because one of the really striking cool things about lions is how warm their fur is. So we actually see always lots of beautiful yellows and warm browns, and these aren't really present in the drawing yet. To bring that warmth in, I am using light yellow ochre and brown ochre and applying a light layer over most of the drawing. At this stage, the pencils do not need to be sharpened to a fine point. Instead, I'm actually mostly using the side of the pencil to lay down the color quickly and already taking into consideration the general direction of the fur. Then I gently blend everything together using a soft tool, and if you don't have a specific one, a cotton bud or the tip of your finger work just as well. And the goal isn't to smudge everything together completely, but just to soften the pencil marks a little bit. Now, one of the biggest things that I've learned from working with pencils over time is that realism comes from building lots of thin layers, not from trying to get everything right in one go. So it's definitely a game of patience, but every new layer adds just a little bit more depth, more richness, and that's what brings the realism into the drawing. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm exercising my patience to repeat this process several times, and I alternate between the brown ochre and the light yellow ochre, and I blend together between each layer to slowly build up this color. As I'm doing this, I am constantly comparing the drawing to the reference, and I am actually looking for areas that need to be a little warmer, a little darker, or lighter. So it's really a continuous process of observing and making small adjustments to let the drawing gradually come together and build this base layer. At this point, we've built up a really nice solid base, and there are plenty of layers on the paper, which will make it much easier to get that soft, realistic finish we're after. So now comes my favorite part, which is actually bringing the texture and the fur to life. I am using here Warm Gray 1, which is the lightest warm gray in the Pitt pastel range, and I'm using it to bring in some light into the hair. So here I really pay attention to the texture, so I use light pencil strokes that follow the direction of the fur. The fur around the eye is actually quite short, so I'm keeping my pencil strokes nice and short as well. It can be tempting to make them longer to speed up the process, but again, be patient. Shorter strokes will give you a much more natural look in the end. And now, risking repeating myself, but one thing that is really important here is to keep an eye on the direction the fur is growing. So, around the eye, a lot of hairs run almost parallel to each other, but as you move up towards the forehead, they start to angle upwards, and around the cheeks, they gradually turn downwards. So, even though it might seem like a small detail, following the natural flow of the fur makes a huge, huge difference. So, don't just look at the colors, keep checking those, of course, but also keep making sure, based on the reference photo, that you are letting it guide the direction of the pencil strokes. From here on, it's really just a matter of building up the layers, and I am basically going back and forth between lighter colors like ivory and also a little bit of Naples yellow, and darker colors like the walnut brown, the Van Dyke brown, and also I use a lot of Payne's gray. And I also use, once again, the brown ochre and the raw umber whenever I feel like an area needs a little bit more warmth. At this point, I'm not really following a set order. I am just constantly looking back at the reference and trying to understand where it needs to be darker or lighter or warmer. So it's really just correcting what needs to be corrected. Also, an important tip here: as I build on the layers, I start sharpening my pencils more often. So for those first layers, a blend pencil is actually perfect because it lets you cover larger areas quickly. But now, when we're getting into the finer details, we need a sharper pencil that makes it easier to create that illusion of individual hairs. So this part definitely takes some time and it can feel a little bit boring, but please do not try to rush through it because it is really, really important that we get these layers right. And all of these things that I've been mentioning, so the values, the tones, the temperature of the colors, this is really what creates the realistic look. Because actually, something that I've noticed is that sometimes when you look at a drawing and something seems slightly off in terms of proportion or maybe even the place, it can just be that your values are wrong. So the values are really what brings the three dimensionality of the drawing together. So if you misplace a shadow or a lighter area, you can completely change the format of the face of the animal, for example, and you can make it look off. So really take this time to try to correct all of that and see if you get all of these colors and all of these values down correctly. And now that the hair around the eye is mostly done, we can actually move on to the eye itself. And here I'm really trying to focus on getting those beautiful yellows and oranges to shine through and really trying to grasp those contrasts of the really light colors and the really dark ones to make the eye look alive and three-dimensional. So before adding the color, I just quickly refine the outline of the eye. And for these, I use the Caput Mortuum pencil and also some black. And I just want to make sure that the shape is exactly where I want it to be before moving on because it's really the hardest thing to correct later on. Then the next thing we need to do is to block in the white from the paper. So we hadn't done that before, unlike with the fur. So for that, in the eye, instead of using the PanPastels, I am using one of the pastel pencils because it allows me to be a little bit more accurate with where I'm placing the color. And I chose the Naples Yellow that I will be using as the mid-tone for the iris. So it's a very highly pigmented yellow pencil that is quite creamy, so also very nice to build the layers on top. Then once again, we start building these layers, and here I work mostly from dark to light. So to give the eye that nice rounded shape, I start by darkening the outer edge of the iris. And here I'm mainly using raw umber and also burnt umber for this. And I bring in a little terracotta to add some extra warmth to the eye. Then working from the outside inwards really helps create that illusion of a sphere, making the eye look much more three-dimensional. Once I'm happy with that, I start then working on the reflections. So from my reference photo, they are positioned on the top part of the eye. So I start working in some lighter colors, and I also bring in some blue because there is a lot of reflection from the sky. So this is a really, really important part of the drawing because it's really what makes the eye come alive. If you do not work these reflections from the light, it will not look natural. Here I used some light ultramarine to get this blue in, and then I also used some ivory, and I added a tiny little bit of white to build these reflections. And the most important thing here, it's also to keep in mind the shape. So try to keep it interesting and really work on making these reflections kind of irregular. Add some silhouettes or um, make sure that you add the reflections from the hair coming from above the eyelid. So all of that, once again, will make it look more real and more natural. Then the last thing to keep in mind is that for that last top layer, make sure that your pencils are really well sharpened, and then you can add the details inside the iris. So if you look closely into a lion's eye, it's actually full of texture. So we really need to make sure that the drawing reflects that as well. So I like adding little dots, short lines, and very subtle, for example, radial strokes that run from the pupil outwards all the way to the edge of the iris. And that really, really helps with this realistic look as well. So to finish up the eye, I am just adding those final little details. And because the surface of the eye is wet and glossy, you will always see these small reflections along the waterline around the eyelids. So I am also adding those in using ivory, warm gray one, and also white. And then I also go in with a black pencil to just darken whatever little area that needs to be a little bit deeper. At this point, the drawing is pretty much finished. The last thing I like to do is take a literal step back and look at it from a bit further away. It is often much easier to spot anything that's missing when you're not looking at it just from a few centimeters away and really getting the bigger picture. So from there, it's all about the finishing touches. I might add a few lighter hairs where the light catches the fur, deepen some of the shadows, bringing in a few cooler tones if an area feels a little bit too warm. And there aren't really any rules at this stage. It's just a matter of comparing your drawing to the reference photo one last time and making those small adjustments until everything feels balanced. Don't forget here, really try to use well sharpened pencils because those crisp individual hairs and fine details are what really makes the whole drawing pop in the end. And the very last step is always adding the whiskers. Here we have them above the eye. So pay attention that not all of them are white. So I like to add a few darker ones, first with a black pencil before coming in with the lighter whiskers. And I have a couple of little tips for this part. First, make sure your pencil is really nice and sharp. And as you draw each whisker, try gently rotating the pencil between your fingers. That way, the point stays sharp for longer, you're less likely to smudge the pastel underneath, and you get a much cleaner, crisper line. And that's it. Our lion's eye is finished. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and maybe even learned a few new techniques along the way. If you do give it a try, I would love to see your version, so feel free to tag me or leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.